central bank digital currency, and what advantages does a stablecoin offer that a digital dollar, say at the Fed, would not be able to offer?
Thank you, Congressman Barr. I'm happy to. I think the first difference is that stablecoins are operational and growing in the market today, and they're built on an open internet technology model. So when we think about all of the things that we've seen built on the open internet, on these open protocols and networks, whether it's ubiquitous information exchange, communications, interaction around the world, that same open internet model is the foundation for stablecoins. And so I think that's a fundamental difference. A CBDC, which is a concept right now, it's not operational, would very likely be a very closed loop technology that's tightly administered and run by the government, and would unlikely be accessible in the same way that these open networks are accessible. And so I think that's a critical difference. But I would come back to the most important, which is that most payment system innovations in the world have been driven by the private sector. And I think what's taking place today with digital currency is no different.
Could stablecoin and your product, could it address some of the concerns about China's advances in terms of, and the threat that China's advances pose to sanctions enforcement and protecting the dollar as the world's reserve currency?
I think so, yes. I mean, coming back to this, and I'll try and make this point concisely, the United States and the US dollar is winning the digital currency space race today. Dollar stablecoins are doing trillions of dollars of transactions. The experimental beta of a Chinese yuan, which is government controlled in China, has done $10 billion of transactions. So the United States is winning. This has the potential to grow at a very significant speed around the world and benefit the US dollar and benefit American businesses and households. And so I think that's one really, really critical thing to understand. And I think the primacy of this infrastructure and the development of this infrastructure, it is a strategic national security and national economic priority for the United States, and we need to get going on it right now.
Thank you. I have many other questions as well, but my time has expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate very much you bringing this to our attention. Appreciate the ranking member, everyone participating today, especially the witnesses. One of the things that's been interesting, I've heard a lot of very high and noble motives today. I think I don't want to misquote people, but I've heard that the digital asset world, the open internet model, it's for all people in the world. It's easier, cheaper, open, free market data. It's transparent, reduces risk, not increases risk. There's less friction in the marketplace. These things are all great, but it's interesting that most of the people that I know that have invested in cryptocurrencies, not because of that, it's because they think they can get rich quick. And the appreciation of Bitcoin is something that they want a part of. It's not because of all these other wonderful things that the internet can do. It's not the reason at all. Secondly, it's interesting when I ask them, well, you know what cryptocurrency and digital assets and Bitcoin, what it actually is? Most of them say, no, I just know that, make a lot of money and I want to invest and I want part of it. I want to be able to invest because I know that that's appreciated. Now, we've seen this before, unfortunately, and it led to, I think, a financial crisis around the world when you were investing in derivatives and other things that people didn't know what the hell they were investing in, and then it became very problematic. So I do see the risk in this. Now, I have to say, when this was a B problem or a B issue, $1 billion problem, didn't seem as such a big deal. But now that it's become a $1 trillion issue, and I do think it's challenging really the supremacy of the dollar around the world, I do think it's potentially a big problem. I do have concerns. I want to follow on to what Mr. Barr said. The issue of the dollar being the reserve currency, this seems it does challenge it. Does someone want to comment on that? If not, I'll pick on somebody in particular.
I'm happy to comment, Congressman. I wanted to respond to a couple things in your comments. I would agree with the fact that there are passerbys and then there are people who are actively building and who are very, very close to the technical innovation. And I think like investments in technology companies or in other businesses that we see in the stock market, you have people who are investing because they think it's a business or a product that might go up. They may not understand the details of a given pharmaceutical company's science, but they believe that perhaps it's an area of innovation and they want to invest in it. And so I do agree that there is that distinction. But I think it's certainly incumbent on all of the industry participants to ensure that there's great amount of disclosure, financial literacy around these products. But more importantly, coming back to the comment about the dollar, I think there is this growth in digital assets as a new kind of asset class. And I think what's important to note is understanding those in contrast to fiat currencies. Many of the digital assets, in fact, I think the overwhelming majority of the digital assets are commodities that have utility, that are used to power some kind of technology network or protocol, more thought of like an oil or gas than a fiat currency. So they exhibit those properties. And I don't think those will ever rival the dollar. I think they'll grow in value because they're utilized to help facilitate all kinds of activity on these Web3 applications and networks. And I do believe that with innovations like stablecoins and dollar digital currencies, we could actually see a dramatic amount of growth in the use of the dollar globally.
I'm gonna reclaim my time just for a second, because one of the things that I see is that we do have we have the digital dollar already. I mean, the digital dollar can do all the things that you guys were talking about today, with the exception that it is a fiat currency that wouldn't be as easily manipulated by some nefarious group, because it would be controlled by the Fed and the United States of America. I mean, I do have great apprehension that you have these cryptocurrencies that are used by drug traffickers, or used by people trafficking other human beings, and there's no good way to control it. So I'm all for digital currency, but why not the dollar? Why can't the dollar be the digital currency? Why can't we once again dominate not 60, 80%, but maybe even higher with a digital dollar? That to me makes much more sense, and it's much more protected, and people won't have the risk. But anyway, I yield back my time, but I did find this a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm a small business owner in Texas, and still own those businesses. I'm a car dealer and a former professional baseball player. And when I'm trying to wrap my head around a new topic like cryptocurrencies, I try to relate it back to something I understand, like baseball or business. Now, some of you may know this, but modern-day baseball can really be attributed to Babe Ruth. He brought in the live ball era of the time and introduced power to the baseball diamond. And before this, teams would play small ball that was very conservative, where teams would literally play for 1 run a game. The entire objective was simply to get the ball in play so they could try to steal their way around the base pass. And there was nothing wrong with this old way of playing, but when the White Sox won the World Series in 1906, the entire team had a total of 6 home runs all year. But Babe Ruth came along. Babe Ruth came along and totally changed everything. In 1920, he set the American League record of home runs with 54. To put that into perspective, how fantastic this feat was at the time, the previous mark to be set was by Sox Seabold in 1902 with just 16. This introduced an entire generation of new baseball fans, and for the first time ever, the New York Yankees, over 1 million fans came to see them in a single season. Now, with that being said, many of you are becoming the Babe Ruth in the financial services space. You're introducing a blockchain technology to the financial services industry and working to upend the tradition and the traditional way of doing business. And while many economists and so-called experts have been calling on the downfall of cryptocurrency and discounting the future of blockchain technologies, all of you were working tirelessly to create something new in order to bring this new technology to the masses. Unfortunately, it would only take a few misguided curveballs, we'll say, from Washington to undo some of the progress you've all put into this motion. So my first question to you, Mr. Brooks, can you talk about some of the negative consequences that could happen if we take a heavy-handed approach to regulating this developing technology?
Well, Mr. Williams, as a long-suffering Dodgers fan, I share a lot of the things you're talking about, and I think the era you're talking about was an era when baseball went from focusing on not losing to an era where it focused on winning. And winning and not losing are not the same thing. So I come back to Mr. Vargas's question a second ago, which I think is the right way to answer your question. You know, Mr. Vargas asked the question of people have the potential to lose a lot of money. These things are volatile, they're risky. How do we protect them from those kinds of issues? There are two ways of answering that. One is to prevent as many people as possible from accessing this amazing technology. For example, the way the current legal regime works is certain kinds of assets can only be purchased by accredited investors, meaning rich people. So the only people who can get rich on this are people who are already rich. That'd be one way of protecting people from losing money, is to make sure that only the richest can access it. Another way of addressing it would be to make it safer the way that we made equities safer 40 years ago, right? We created mutual funds, diversification, sector funds, and other things that make it easier for regular Americans from places like my hometown in Colorado to buy equities without having to be stock experts. Strangely, in the US, we've refused to do that so far. So we don't allow crypto mutual funds. We don't allow people to diversify the way that they do in Canada, Germany, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, and a series of other regulated economies around the world. So I would argue the way to win is to bring more people into the system more safely, not to keep them out at their own peril.
Great. Second question, we often hear that crypto industry is the wild, wild west, where there is no regulation guiding the industry. But as all of you are aware, that simply is not true. The SEC and the CFTC are the primary federal regulators, and our states also have strict regulations that all of you must be abiding by. So, Mr. Bankman-Fried, can you discuss the different layers of regulation that FTX must abide by as an exchange, and also in order to uphold customers' deposits in your digital wallets?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. And you know, putting aside the 190 other regulatory jurisdictions that we take part in and the dozens of licenses that we are acquiring each month in all of those, in the United States, there is the sort of state-level money transmitting license regime with, you know, money service business and MTLs, which you know, we and many others are part of. For any margined or financed or derivatives transactions in the United States, there is a CFTC regime where you know, there's licensure required to offer those products. For any products that might be a security as a digital asset, one would, it's, you know, there doesn't exist a current very clear pathway for it, but that would be an SEC registered regime for it. Obviously, there's been lots of discussions about additional registered regimes for stablecoins and other assets as well.
Thank you. I think my time is up, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I came up vastly before I thought I was going to, which means that you'll have to humor me for my ill-formed thoughts. I really appreciate our witnesses coming here, and I also feel terrible for you, because we could have an entire hearing on stablecoin, we could have an entire hearing on blockchain, we could have an entire hearing on CBDCs, I suppose, and we could probably have an entire hearing on whether or not things that have forced scarcity are inherent stores of value, except that I think we resolved that 100 years ago, but yet we still sort of need to debate it periodically. All that said, I want to start just focusing on stable coins, if I could. And Mr. Allaire, want to start with you, and I'm sure you've seen the Presidential Working Group's report, you know, raising all sorts of issues with stable coins, primarily around do they really look like money, right? You know, do they have sufficient reserve assets behind them? What are the redemption rules? Is there transparency around permissioned blockchains, the custody of reserve assets? You've read the report, I'm sure. I see you nodding, could go on. First question is just really simple. Do you support the recommendations of that report for stablecoins?
So I support a number of things, but not uniformly. I think there are a number of challenges with the report. I think the first maybe to discuss is really this question of what form of federal charter ought to be in place around a large-scale dollar stablecoin issuer. I think the report recommends that it would be an insured depository institution, but I think one of the really critical things to discuss there is an FDIC-insured bank is FDIC insured because the bank is taking risk with deposits. And
Yeah,
so,
and if I could, and I'm apologize to get you off, but I want to just narrow sort of specifically to the issue of if I deposit something in a bank that is indexed to $1 and I perceive as a customer that this is, I've eliminated the FX risk, right? But now I'm left saying, is it actually there when I want it and are there sufficient, setting aside how we get it done, broadly speaking, are you supportive of the idea that if this is going to look and feel and attract investors with the expectations that this has all the risk and liquidity profiles of $1, that we should make sure that it actually has those features?
absolutely. So full reserve, disclosures, transparency, I think definitions around what those reserves are and the liquidity mandate on it, those are all really critical features that need to come in place. If it's full reserve, is it an FDIC insured product, or is it a statutory set of constraints around what the reserves are? So those are some of the things that I think have to be worked through.
And I want to get to two more questions, so apologize if I'm being quick, but in the absence of those protections being in place, it seems to me that somebody who is currently holding a stable coin perceives that they are holding a currency, but in reality is holding something that is subject to a lot of exogenous risks beyond their control, which feels a lot more like a commodity. So if we agree that as of right now, it's not really a currency, would you also be supportive of saying, well, we should regulate it as a commodity until such time as we have the protections in place to give it the robustness of a currency that the market is expecting of it?
So I don't agree with that, but I think it raises a couple of key points. So the first is, and I can only really speak on behalf of Circle here, USDC, for example, operates under the same stored value electronic money and electronic money transmission statutes that govern Square and Stripe and PayPal and the balances there. So today, there are consumer protections. There are reserve requirements around holding of those assets, one-for-one redeemability, anti-money laundering requirements, surety bonds that need to be posted to protect consumers, segregation of client funds and for benefit of customer accounts. So there's a great deal that's there. And we have operated under such statutes really since 2014. We were the first company to go and get all those licenses. So there is a framework today. I think as these get larger and are operating at a global scale, I think really does there need to be something more that's more bespoke to this?
Let me, if I could, because I'm just nervous watching the time here. Let me sort of get to the last question, leave it to the whole panel, and if we're out of time, we'll follow up separately. The concern I have is that a stable coin at some level is an ETF, right? And we could imagine a stable coin indexed to all sorts of different currencies and some kind of baskets of currencies that are behind there. And we regulate those in certain ways with expectations of who is bearing the risk, to Mr. Perlmutter's question. We have this emerging world of central bank digital currencies, and I'm satisfied that no central bank wants to allow counterfeiting. They all want to protect the integrity of their currency, and so they'll put those rules in place. On the other hand, different countries are going to have very different ideas about what kind of data they would like to track when we trade a central bank digital currency. And so, a question for any of you who feel technically competent to answer this: if you have a stable coin that includes some portion of central bank digital currencies that are tracking things that we as Americans would not like to track, can we design the stablecoin to insulate the contamination of that system so that somebody who believes that they are buying something that looks like $1 is not actually being tracked by our adversaries? Anybody like to comment on that?
I'll make one quick comment, which is one of the benefits of this technology is these stablecoins, all of the code that they provide and how they interact is all public and open source. And so everything that functions inside of that is visible to everyone that interacts with it. And so there is the ability to have, I think, greater transparency into how are these things functioning, including a foreign issued coin.
I'm out of time, but I do have some, I think there's some
Gentleman's
concerns
time
about the
has
encrypted
expired.
rules as well. Thank you. If anyone would like to follow up, I'd love to.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thanks to the ranking member, thanks to our witnesses, and frankly, many people who've worked literally years to get to this point to have a hearing. The market has been way ahead of this, and frankly, it's been painful to watch, in 2017 and since, when you see the ICO market ripe with people committing fraud or just regulatory arbitrage, taking advantage of the fact that our regulators haven't paid attention to bad actors And it's been especially frustrating to watch some of our regulators take aim at people that are working very hard and very aggressively to be legitimate businesses, to come into compliance with every kind of licensure and regulatory regime that our country currently offers. It's been woefully inadequate, and so it's so good to get to this point for the hearing. So thank you, and then thanks to my colleagues. I've been very encouraged by the amount of preparation many colleagues have done to close the gap in any knowledge they've had, and over the past few years, the number of members of Congress that really understand this space has certainly increased. 3 years ago, we had a hearing, not really a hearing, because as a junior member, I can't hold those or pick them. So in exasperation, we just held a meeting over at the Library of Congress, and some of the folks in this room were there, or representatives from your companies were there, and we came up with the most essential thing was to establish a bright line test, not just for the players in the industry, not just for the investors, but also for the regulators, so that if somebody at the SEC, for example, says this looks like a security, it's not a form of interpretive art to say, does it really fit this test? We came up with 4-part test that said it's already created, it exists, that it is recorded on a distributed, secure, and immutable ledger, that is not controlled by a central authority, that permissionless peer-to-peer transactions can be done without an intermediary, and it does not represent a financial interest in any entity. More important than that particular test is the fact that there is, as Mr. Brooks, you highlighted, a speed limit, so that there's some clear thing, not just, as I say, for the investors, not just for the participants in the market, but for the regulators themselves, so that we have continuity. If only there were such a body that could provide this clarity. My hope is that the next time we have a hearing, we will notice some bills, and we'll be able to talk about particular text towards that. So, Mr. Brooks, when you look at stable coins, which maybe is the lowest hanging fruit, some of those are established well in long-standing things like New York trusts. Some of those aren't traded in anything. They're just U.S. dollars stored in a vault for every token. Some have U.S. dollars in components of M2, like U.S. Treasuries. Some have other things. When you were at the OCC, you provided some clarity there, and you also dealt importantly with self-custody. Mr. Allaire, you mentioned that the code is literally online. Any of us right now during the hearing could download code and could begin to self-custody a digital asset. So as you look at that, how important is it to provide this clarity, Mr. Brooks?
Well, specifically on the issue of custody and self-custody, this is a way that crypto tries to make an advance over the current system. So the issue with custodial assets we've seen, and this committee's looked at many, many times. Think about the financial crisis when there was an issue of foreclosures, and it was difficult for custodians to produce the original note that proved whoever was entitled to enforce that transaction and foreclose on a property because the piece of paper had gone missing or the custodian had merged with another custody company or whatever. One of the things crypto's trying to do is to use technology so that you can safekeep your own assets for free versus having to pay somebody else to custody it. That also provides a layer of financial privacy, something that this committee usually favors, but sometimes, strangely, doesn't favor. So self-custody is one of the key things, along with self-ownership and self-determination on this Internet of Value, that's really critical to the nature of the network.
Yeah, thank you. And as we've digitized information, it's frankly, amazing that we've finally digitized money in a way that we can move not just a store of value, but a means of exchange. The use case for digital assets has partially been that it's this stable store of value. Certainly stable coins solve that. Some have pointed out that Bitcoin, for example, doesn't. And, Mr. Bankman-Fried, one of the ways that people have speculated that the volatility is created in the market isn't by holders of the asset or hodlers, hold on for dear lifers, as has become known in the space, but by the other big group that owns these assets, which are traders. Many of them trade on leverage. And so when you look at leverage, you made a lot of news by saying, we're capping people at 20 times leverage. That's a lot of leverage. But you also pointed out that the average leverage on FTX was around 2x. So could you talk about the importance of leverage in volatility?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The first thing that I'll say is in cryptocurrencies, in digital assets, as like essentially every other financial asset in the world. More volume trades through futures contracts than through the spot asset. The reason for this is basically it's more economically efficient. It's much more capital efficient. The lack of an immediate delivery requirement on the physical creates a much easier ability for people to hedge exposure, for people to express opinions. And so for all those reasons, I think that they're an important part of the digital asset ecosystem, as they are of every other ecosystem. I'll just briefly say it's important to have robust risk engines that monitor the positions on these assets. We've gone through multiple very large up and down moves and been able to manage positions both times.
Thank you, and thanks again for the hearing. I feel like I've spoken to Steve Case in like 1990, so thanks for the vision that you guys have, and thanks for the hearing, Madam Chairwoman.
You're welcome. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I represent the South Bronx, which is often said to be the poorest congressional district in America, and of greatest concern to me are the use cases of crypto that would improve the lives of the people of the South Bronx. I represent a heavy population of immigrants who often pay predatory fees in order to send remittances to their loved ones abroad. So what can crypto, blockchain, Web3 do for that Dominican immigrant in the South Bronx who is burdened by remittance fees that she cannot afford? How much more affordably and quickly can the crypto economy facilitate remittances? Mr. Cascarilla, if you could take that question and please be specific.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think this is a really important element of the technology, which again is that it's open to anybody. You don't need to have a bank account. You don't need to, in fact, rely on any intermediary. So somebody who's an immigrant and wants to send a remittance to a family member in another country is able to do that. And there's ways to do it with both crypto and to do it with a stable coin. And all you need to do is download a wallet, and then you can send it to somebody else anywhere in the world. And so this is a really powerful tool for democratization of access, especially for those who have difficulty getting bank accounts. There's no minimum fees, there's no minimum balances, there's no check cashing fees that are part of this technology. And you can do it in some cases for a penny or less.
And how much quicker?
Well, this is an important point. Blockchains, part of the beauty of them is that they're operating 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So it can be sent just about instantaneously. There's no multi-day lags that you have right now. And that change in the speed is just crucial because usually it's these lags that really are very costly.
I'm going to interject. Mr. Brooks, I have a question about the challenge of enforcing laws in a world of decentralization, whether it be law enforcement relating to financial crimes or SEC disclosure. How exactly do you enforce the law when there is no central entity against which to enforce the law? How do we grapple with that challenge?
That is a great question, Mr. Torres. I really appreciate you asking it. So I'd say a couple things about it. First of all, to the extent that some of the activity we're talking about is parallel to activity that happens in the supervised system, my question is, why don't we allow it in the supervised system? Again, you've heard me say it before this morning, but you have on this panel a big stablecoin issuer who's applied for a bank charter. Doesn't look like they're going to get it. Easiest way to supervise that would be to let them in the banking system and have the OCC have authority over them. So I'd start with that. The second point is, lots of these decentralization protocols are designed to solve the exact problems that create the need for enforcement in the first place, because most enforcement in the securities and banking system is about some combination of human error, human negligence, human greed, or human bias. And the point of some of these decentralized systems is to take that out and have an open source piece of software everybody can look at and do with those things algorithmically. So as an example, I used to sit on a bank credit committee. We would decide who got credit and who didn't. And I think we had a really good system for it, but we were human beings. We might have been indulging in implicit bias. We might have made mistakes. Algorithms don't do that. So some of the need for what you're talking about goes away in a decentralized system.
And I know there are critics who have said that the blockchain might not be as secure and as unhackable as advertised. But for me, the proper question is not whether the blockchain is perfectly secure and unhackable. The question is whether it's better than everything else. Like Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government with the exception of everything else. Is there a computer network that is more secure than the blockchain?
Well, I think the beauty of the blockchain is not that it's perfectly secure, it's that it's perfectly transparent. So you can see when somebody's screwed around
But I want to specifically address security. Is there a computer network, to your knowledge, that is more secure than the blockchain?
I don't know of one, but we have a PhD in physics sitting right next to me, so we'll let him,
I'll
answer.
If you're talking about any major globally used blockchain, I don't know of one. There are small blockchains that are less secure. All the major ones are incredibly secure.
And one of my concerns about crypto is that it would present a challenge to the supremacy of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. But what I have found striking is that the leading stablecoin issuers have actually chosen to peg their stablecoins to the dollar, which strikes me as a vote of confidence that reinforces rather than challenges the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So what are your thoughts on the relationship between the dollar and the crypto? Is it as contradictory as many have feared, or could it be actually complementary?
I'll answer that. I actually don't think that it's contradictory at all. What people want is a US dollar bank account. Everywhere in the world, people want to be able to have US dollars. And actually, that's the hardest thing to get. And crypto is a tool for a lot of different things, including bringing communities together. But what people want in order for their everyday spending, it's dollars. If you're in Argentina, you want dollars. If you're somebody anywhere in the world, you want to have access to dollars. And that's the hardest thing to get access to right now. And that's why tokenized dollars is so valuable, because you don't need to have a bank account, yet you can have access to the dollar-based system. And a very, very important tool for inclusion.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and my apologies to the panel. I had to leave to manage a bill on the House floor dealing with a very exciting issue of LIBOR. I will not.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're getting there, Madam Chair. But to my colleague from New York, I do want to point out that this isn't quite the same, but the same idea exists. Committee of Republicans released a CBDC, a central bank digital currency principles recently, and of those, we had said in this as one of those principles is we need to make sure that the private sector leads the way, but we need to ensure that the U.S. dollar remains the preeminent currency. And so that is a common goal, certainly, and we've been very aggressive in trying to lay that out. I've got a short amount of time. I'm going to try and go through as quickly as possible, and I'm going to peek around my colleague from West Virginia here, trying to get to Mr. Bankman-Fried real quickly. And again, I apologize, I'm not trying to replow ground that has already been gone over, but how many various levels and types of regulators do you currently engage with? Because I know you are worldwide, you've indicated that you have multiple regulators that you currently work with. I'm curious if you can even peg that number.
Yeah, so I mean, there are dozens, probably soon hundreds worldwide that we're engaging with. And you know, that includes all across Europe, all across Asia. And then, you know, within the United States, we're engaging with state money transmitter, money service business licensure. We have a CFTC license for derivatives. We're engaging with the SEC. And, you know, I anticipate more agencies getting involved soon as well.
Well, yes, and I want to make sure that we are not over-regulating that. One, I'm sure it has cost you an untold amount of money so far, and I'm sure everyone that has been dealing with that. But I also want to make sure, and no offense to any of you, I want to make sure that there are others who are going to be able to enter that space, and that they are not being blocked out, and that there is an artificial barrier to entry that is going to allow others to do, frankly, what you all did, which was be innovative and supply a product to people who are looking for that product. I'm going to have to move really quickly. I'm going to go to Mr. Brooks on a couple of things. Would you describe why establishing these clear rules of the road is important? Before we, an important step before we add additional regulation and consider that regulation?
Well, Mr. Huizinga, it's good to see you again. I think the most important reason of many is international competitiveness. So other countries make this easier. Okay, let me just make clear, other companies make this easier, other countries. I just came yesterday from the Middle East, where in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, they have super clear derivatives regulations, super clear ETF regulation. They're trying to lure Americans over there to build these products, and they're moving there.
So how are they viewing these crypto assets differently than traditional assets? I mean, what Rubicon have they crossed that we haven't? And why is it important to think about digital assets differently?
Well, I think one of the things that they've figured out is that crypto actually is less fundamentally different than equities and debt than you think it is. It's a risk-on asset that people want to invest in. They want to invest it in Canada, so Canada builds a regime for it. They want to do it in Germany. We're the last country standing that hasn't figured that out. It's a risk-on asset that people want exposure to as part of asset diversification.
As opposed to traditional assets.
Correct.
Okay. I've got a minute left here. So, Ms. Haas, if you indicated in your testimony that, quote, every asset listed on Coinbase platform is subject to rigorous legal, compliance, and security review, close quote. Could you provide us specific details on what Coinbase's process has been to be able to make that type of statement?
Thank you for the question. Yes, so specifically for the legal review, we assess each asset under the Howey test, where we, as Brian Brooks spoke about earlier, through the Crypto Ratings Council have established a framework where we look at the risk factors and we determine whether or not it meets characteristics of the Howey test. It's a risk-based assessment. It is not a black and white test. But based on our assessment, we believe it's lower risk that these are securities and before we list them on our platform. We separately do a compliance review. Our compliance review includes looking at the developers of the token, ensuring they're not on an OFAC sanctions list. We look at to make sure it's not a scam, that there's actual people using this coin, that it was developed in sound manners. And then we look at a security review to understand the underlying code to say, can we provide custody for this? Is this at heightened risk of an attack or someone pulling the value from these assets? So it's security, legal, and compliance before we list an asset.
Okay, and I'm hoping that the chair will grant me leave for my LIBOR work to just end with a closing statement as my time is up here. A number of you have brought up the unbanked and underbanked. And despite rhetoric that gets thrown around, all of us on this committee are very concerned about it. I happen to represent the second poorest county in the state of Michigan, which is in the top 100 poorest counties in the nation. And I understand what it means for these unbanked and underbanked folks to be involved in the process. What I want to make sure is what we do, not just here today, but in the future. We tend to be lag indicators at the government level and with regulators rather than on that front end. And I'm hoping that we do nothing to harm their opportunity to engage in the process. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, and thank you for LIBOR. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Henry. This is a very extraordinary meeting, and I would like to, again, as everyone else, welcome all our people who are testifying today to this committee, which is very important. I'm not sure, probably it would take me a long time to understand what all we mean by cryptocurrency. And I just heard some testimony stating that how we lag behind all other countries in making changes. And this is to everyone. My colleagues, Representative Soto and myself, and 8 other members of Congress, led a letter to leadership addressing the digital assets provisions that expand the definition of broker under Section 6045, param C1 of the Internal Revenue Code in 1986 to include any person who, for consideration, is responsible for the regular provision and service of effectively transfer of digital assets on behalf of another person. As drafted, the provision would include miners and other validated, as well as software and hardware wallet makers who do not engage in trading activities and are beyond the scope of broker services. What are your thoughts on this provision? Do you think this is a good tax policy to require non-brokers to report on transactions for people who are not even their customer? Why or why not? And this is to the whole committee.
Well, maybe I can jump in there, Congressman. It's Brian Brooks speaking here just for a moment. I've said many times that that language would be sort of like requiring YouTube to get an FCC broadcast license because they're a person engaged in distributing television content. I think what we need to recognize is there's a difference between centralized exchanges. You have two of the biggest ones represented here who all agree that they should be engaged in tax reporting, and they do that, versus decentralized algorithms where there is no company involved in the transactions at all, and there's no one well situated to provide that kind of tax reporting. So that distinction is, I think, super clear. The technology has enabled people to transact peer-to-peer with no intermediary. So who is it that we're asking to do the tax reporting in that context?
Anyone else would like to speak on that?
Yeah, just one. This is Danelle Dixon from the Stellar Development Foundation. One of the issues that I think that is a problem with this is that it may seek to require these entities that actually don't have access to any personal information at all. Because as the validators, they're actually just validating the transaction and don't know who those individuals are that are on the other side of it. It might require them to gain access to that information, which is exactly what I think many of you and us do not want.
Anyone else before I go to the next question? Well, this question is for Ms. I hope I pronounce this right, Ms. Haas. Does Coinbase have multiple lines of business? Have multiple lines of business? How are each line of business segregated and ring-fenced from one another to a confidential information is not improperly used, where confidential information not improperly used?
Thank you for the question. Coinbase does have multiple products. In many cases, we consider our products a product family where we're serving one customer and the customer benefits by having those products within one application. So for example, we provide custodial services, which is for all intents and purposes a wallet where they can hold their crypto assets. But then integrated with that is the ability to trade out of that account and then to settle new assets back into that account. So those are different products to be able to store versus be able to buy or sell, but they're integrated products. Those we have within one legal entity as an example. They are offered as one product family. That is different from when we offer products such as our Coinbase Cloud offering, where we're using our technology to allow others to build in the crypto economy. That data is 100% ring-fenced, not allowed through any of our other products, and we do segregate data. We have different engineers, we have different legal entities, and we provide a lot of protection. So it depends on the product that you're speaking about, Congressman, and some we share and some are very much ring-fenced.
Okay, real quick, another question. Do withdrawal fees apply to taking crypto off the platform? What fees apply? How are these fees calculated?
No, we do not charge any fees to withdraw crypto from our platform.
Okay, with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate this good, productive hearing and the good questions from both sides of the aisle, and appreciate the panel being here. Let me start with Mr. Brooks. You've had some good comments about the presidential working group on whether stable coins should be banks or not. But on the issue of the wallet, what should members of Congress be concerned about in sort of that regulatory umbrella of any individual's wallet? Do you anticipate really tens of thousands of wallet providers or hundreds? And I know in the working group, they suggested it too should be a bank, or I assume connected to a bank. So is that really necessary? And talk to me about wallets for our consumers to have access.
Yeah, well, Congressman Hill, thank you for that question. That is an important one. And I think, as I said earlier, the ability of people to self-custody their own assets and to send them directly without using an intermediary is at the core of what we're trying to build. So if we made it so that wallets had to be hosted by a bank or some other regulated institution, you know, we already have that. We already have banks, and that'll take time.
Hey, Ann, I'm in committee. How things going? I said, I'm in committee. How things are going?
Mr. Lawson? Please mute. You're unmuted. Please mute. Please mute. Mr. Lawson, please mute. Thank you.
Okay, so just to finish the thought.
Meanwhile, back at the ranch.
Exactly. So the ability to self-custody is really, really important. My point about the role of the banking system is simply that, again, to my point of parity, an asset that is or a transaction that's allowed to be done inside of a bank shouldn't be technology specific. It should be technology agnostic. If you're engaged in payments or lending, you should be able to do that however. But wallets are critical. What's missing from this, which technologists are building today, are crypto native identification protocols that will allow us, without getting the name and the taxpayer ID number of the person on the other side, to know that it's a safe wallet, not a blocked wallet. And that is in development today by multiple
Yeah, I think
companies.
that's critical because this, we like the concept of not being spied upon by the actions in our wallet, and yet we all want to comply with the rules around AML, BSA, and so anonymously securing that the wallet is in compliance is sort of an important feature of it.
Absolutely.
Ms. Haas, community banks have been the backbone, of course, of our local markets and critical. And in September, it was announced that you partnered with Vast Bank, with your institution, to provide crypto banking services. So maybe others can comment, but let's start with you. For aiding a normal community bank customer out there in my district, or someone who wants to innovate in a bank and using crypto products, are we in a good position regulatorily, or are there changes we need to make?
I'm going to speak about two things. One, I'm going to talk about how they can do it, and separate, we can talk about the regulatory environment. So Coinbase has tools to allow any bank to be able to provide crypto to their customers, where we want to make our back-end services, our 9 years of experience of safely custodying crypto assets and being able to integrate with blockchains, available to all global users. And one way we do this is by letting banks partner with us and white label our tooling so that they can offer this directly to their customers. There does need to be continued innovation and clarity on behalf of many banks about what is permissible activities for them, and banks that we partner with and speak about their ability to offer crypto to their end customers are working with their various state and federal regulators to gain clarity about what would be permissible for them to offer to their end consumers.
Thank you. This is a big deal because having spent almost 4 decades in and out of that business, banks are gun-shy about their regulatory burden, as Mr. Brooks certainly knows, and being cleared for that IT exam or their new product review exam at their board level is really not something that bank boards want to be surprised about in this arena. Mr. Cascarla, on Paxos, you have a view on that, on partnering with banks?
Yes, as maybe some members know, we have a number of partnerships with banks, and they work with us today. I think we're an infrastructure provider. So for us, banks are an important customer set. I think that they're trying to upgrade their infrastructure to be able to adapt to this new technology. There's a recognition that the way the current financial system is working today is not really adapting to the 21st century needs of a digital economy. And so I think that there are important ways in which the current financial system can upgrade itself. Traditional assets can now move on blockchains, dollars, gold, securities. And it's not just about crypto, which, as exciting as it is only one piece of this broader transformation that's happening.
Thanks. What one regulatory issue would be important to you at that community bank level? And if you would, respond to me in writing. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, who is also the chair of the Task Force on Artificial Intelligence, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to our witnesses. I'd like to focus on what I think is the crucial importance of having a secure digital identity for crypto asset transactions. First, regarding controlled anonymity for prevention of criminal activities, it seems to me that if we wish to prevent crypto assets from being used, for example, for ransomware or other criminal payments, that there is no logical alternative to having all crypto transactions associated with a legally traceable identity, someone who can be extradited if they do something criminal, and which these can be pseudonymous to market participants and to the public, but that must be capable of being de-anonymized pursuant to the action of a court in a trusted jurisdiction. Do any of you disagree with that conclusion, that this is a necessary condition for preventing, for example, ransomware? So let the record show that no one raised objection to that statement. So I think that's very significant. So we have to start planning for a system where in a court, in a suitable jurisdiction, can actually de-anonymize any legitimate crypto asset. Okay, and now that is relevant to to crypto assets such as stable coins or CBDCs that have stable valuations but still could be used for criminal activities. But for crypto assets which are speculatively traded, then we also have an additional worry, which is abusive trading practices. In that case, we need to know not only the beneficial owner behind a trade, but there has to be a uniquely identified beneficial owner. There has to be a regulator that can see, oh, this is a wash trade because, even though they look like separate pseudonymous IDs, they are in fact the same person. And so that, historically in trading, that has required to have a regulator that can see the true beneficial owners. We spent a decade trying to get the beneficial owner onto the consolidated audit trail, which probably you're aware of. So do you think that is also a logically necessary condition to prevent wash trades and similar abuses? Yeah, Mr. Bankman.
Yeah, I'll say I do think that it is, and we conduct know your customer diligence on all of our users so that we do know who the participants are. We're responsive to governmental inquiries about that. We're overseen by the CFTC on that with FTX US derivatives. I also think that this is a powerful argument in favor of having harmonized regulatory and market frameworks, in particular between different asset classes, where if you end up with a different regulatory framework for the market's regulation of Bitcoin derivatives, stablecoin derivatives, Ethereum derivatives, and other assets, you end up making it not just riskier and harder and more annoying for the user to access and more overhead for the industry, but you make it hard to have consistent regulatory oversight of a fractured regime.
No, I agree completely. Look, I have been lurking in the deep weeds for over a decade and trying to get this split inside Congress and between the SEC and CFTC. It just, this is not something anyone would have created, but have you had that discussion with, a number of you expressed enthusiasm for having a single unified national regulator. Have you run that past the Ag Committee? No, look, I know the answer to that. I mean, this is one of the original sins of Congress as it's constituted, and financial services have been suffering from it for a while. Now, in terms of tax payments, it seems to me that if there was simply the requirement for any digitally traded asset to be associated with a pseudonymized, basically a tax ID, that you have an API provided by the government that says, I want to give me a pseudonymous tax ID, and that be put publicly on the blockchain, then and that blockchain be listed with the tax authorities, that then the tax authorities could just run a piece of software and calculate how much tax everyone's owed. It seems like that's a very lightweight requirement, even on a startup in this business. Is there anything wrong with that concept?
Congressman Foster, I think you've raised a number of really critical issues here around identity and the importance of that for law enforcement and transparency and auditability. I think it's a critical area. I think there's some critical things that have to be balanced, of course. I think most of us would agree, I hope, that privacy, security, limiting the leakage of personal identifiable information and data breaches, these are real challenges. Blockchains provide a very powerful way to have assured data. They also provide auditability and transparency. And so there's actually a risk of, if you connect too much personal identifiable information to these, that could be abused.
Yeah,
and so
but
I think
the only personal identifier is it's pseudonymous. You can cryptographically inspect it, make sure it's valid, issued by whatever government you claim to be domiciled in has issued this, and then that's all you need to know.
I would agree with that. I think really a critical next step for this industry are digital identity standards that allow, using cryptographic proofs, using crypto technology itself to prove that someone has been KYC'd, prove that someone has an
I agree, and this is we have legislation on that subject, and thank you, and I was,
of course,
yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, and thanks to our witnesses for joining us today. Congress really needs to better understand the great opportunities that your businesses are bringing to this country. Mr. Bankman-Fried, I have several questions for you and would appreciate as much as you can quick answers. so we can make the most of the time that we have. FTX US offers crypto commodity derivatives products, such as futures and options contracts. To provide these products in the United States, it's my understanding that FTX US has obtained at least 4 licenses from the CFTC, which you listed in your testimony.
That's correct.
Do you know, are there any additional licenses separate from those 4 listed in your testimony that are required by the CFTC for FTX US derivatives to be fully compliant with US derivatives regulation?
I do not believe so.
I think that's correct. And where does the price discovery, sir, for your CFTC-regulated crypto commodity derivatives contracts primarily come from?
So there's a very large number of market participants that participate in those. There are hundreds of billions of dollars per day globally of volume in similar products. And like other markets, we don't choose that pricing. It's a market-based pricing that comes from a variety of liquidity buyers, market-making firms, individual users, and other people.
Right, and I mean, I'll note that for Bitcoin futures contracts that trade on the CME, which is a CFTC-regulated exchange, 100% of that pricing comes from 5 U.S. crypto spot exchanges, Bitstamp, Coinbase, Gemini, Itbit, and Kraken. We have seen disapproval letters from the SEC on multiple Bitcoin spot ETF applications. I don't know if you're aware of that. Chair Gensler's justification for not allowing Bitcoin spot ETFs to trade is his belief that Bitcoin spot markets are, quote, vulnerable to fraud and manipulation. Now, it's my understanding that FTX uses surveillance trade technology akin to the technology national securities exchanges use to protect investors and ensure sound spot markets. What does this technology and any other tools FTX uses to protect the spot market from fraud and manipulation look like?
Yeah, so, like other exchanges, we do have these technologies. In addition to the, know your customer policies that we can identify individuals associated with trades, we have surveillance for unusual trading activity. We have manual inspections of anything that, gets flagged either by the automated surveillance or by manual inspection. And we do this with the trading activity, with the deposits, the withdrawals, and everything else.
Sounds like you're doing a lot to make sure there is no fraud or other manipulation. Thank you, Mr. Bankman-Fried.
Thank you.
Again, for helping us understand the extensive guardrails a cryptocurrency exchange like FTX has in place to ensure sound crypto spot markets for investors. The SEC has approved several Bitcoin futures ETFs that get 100% of their pricing from U.S. crypto spot markets. So I guess I'm left incredibly confused by how the SEC's concern over spot market vulnerability applies to Bitcoin spot ETFs when it doesn't apply to Bitcoin futures ETFs. And by the way, this is not a partisan issue. I've been working closely with Darren Soto on our blockchain caucus co-chair on this very issue. Why? Because the bottom line is that Americans deserve access to a wide, diverse range of investment products. They deserve to choose what investment vehicle they want to put their hard-earned money into. But the SEC is not providing Americans this choice when it comes to crypto commodity ETFs for reasons, again, that just don't make a lot of sense, especially after highlighting the extensive measures crypto exchanges take to protect their spot markets. Our strong crypto and Web3 markets have been in the United States, have been giving the United States up incredible capital market success. These markets are also teeing Americans up for incredible capital formation opportunities. But our regulators simply aren't capitalizing on the opportunity here, and it's my constituents and all of your constituents who are taking the hit because of this, and it must change. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I hope this is the first of many of these discussions we have as Congress tries to put together a thoughtful, light touch guide framework for the industry. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We've been joined by Mr. Sherman from California, who's been on the floor working on his beloved bill on LIBOR, and I understand it's been put up for a vote, and we're all looking forward to voting for this bipartisan legislation. So this gentleman from California, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Crypto is many different things. Cryptocurrency is an incredibly volatile investment that aspires to be a currency that might displace or at least compete with the dollar. A stable coin aspires to be incredibly stable and is tied to the dollar. What they share is a culture, a vibe, a stick-it-to-the-man moniker, a belief that somehow this is new and hip and an attack on the powers of society. But the fact is that the advocates of crypto represent the powers in our society. The powers in our society on Wall Street and in Washington have spent millions and are trying to make billions or trillions in the crypto world. These include Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Visa, BlackRock, Citadel, Musk, and Zuckerberg, not to mention the CEOs that are before us here today. Everyone before us today is a crypto advocate. We will at some point hear from the crypto critics. We won't hear from CEOs. We'll hear from academics with their pencils and pens. Today we hear from the CEOs with their lobbyists, their PACs, and their power. And we wonder why we won't be able to protect investors. The regulators need to listen to this hearing very carefully. With all the money and power on one side, we will not be able to pass meaningful legislation. Don't cop out and say, well, you're not going to do anything until we pass meaningful legislation. And if you wonder about where the power is, Zuckerberg had to come here himself and sit there. Brian Armstrong sent his number 2. And Tether doesn't bother to show up at all. Zuckerberg did not have a day in the park. He did not enjoy it, but he had to come. Armstrong didn't, and Tether ain't here at all. Now, the number one threat to cryptocurrency is crypto. Bitcoin could be displaced by Ether, which could be displaced by Dodge, which could be displaced by Hamster Coin. And then there's Cobra Coin. And what could Mongoose Coin do to crypto coin? In the area of fiat currency, the dollar will always be more important than the Uruguayan peso, and the Uruguayan peso is not a joke. There will always be an Uruguay, and the Uruguayan peso will always have some value. Will Mongoose Coin always have a value? I don't know. I just made it up. It's a joke. Although I said that about Hamster Coin, and then I found out there really was a Hamster Coin. It's not fair to compare fiat currency's current system to what cryptocurrencies aspire to be. It is true. You try to use a credit card or debit card to buy a sandwich today, the system takes 1%, 0.5%, 50 cents away from the merchant. You try to use crypto to buy a sandwich today, I don't know where you can go in Washington to use a Bitcoin to buy a sandwich. Can't be done at all. But someday. So we compare to what we hope crypto can do to the problems that we face with fiat currencies now. That's not a fair comparison. Now, looking at Ms. Haas from Coinbase, if I take $100 on your exchange, buy some Bitcoin, and then a couple days later, say Bitcoin happens to be selling at the exact same price, I sell it. It's my understanding that I get $94.02 back. Am I wrong?
We have multiple products, and it would depend.
Yes or no? Would I get, in that exact transaction, $94.02 back? Am I wrong?
I can't answer the question. It depends on the product.
Okay. Are there products where I'd be right?
There is a product where you'd be right.
Okay, so I could lose $6 in 2 days. What about Tether? Buy $100 worth of Tether, 2 days later, sell $100 worth of Tether, or sell the Tether. Could I lose $6?
Yes.
Okay. Let's turn to
Technically
Mr.
4.
What?
It's a 2% charge.
A 2% charge. I thought it would be a 3% charge. It's $2.99 last time I was on your site.
No.
Okay. I'm looking at Coinbase fee, $2.99 on US TD. We'll put this in the record. In any case, to lose even 2%, let alone 3%, and then another 2 or 3% on the way out in scarcely a couple of days, that's well over 1,000% interest lost in that period of time. Mr. Allaire, is your reserves all in instruments that yield less than 1/10 of 1%?
That is correct.
Then how do you pay 1% interest on some deposits?
We don't pay interest on deposits.
And yet you have a deal with, my time has expired.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Laudermilk, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for having this hearing. I think it's very intriguing and very timely with where we are with the progression of technology. I go back and I think about my 30 years I spent in the IT field. Had the government gotten in the way of the internet, we would still be using dial-up today to do a lot of what we're doing. So I think we have to proceed very cautiously. One thing I've learned in the 30 years in the IT sector, especially 10 years that I spent in the intelligence realm in the Air Force, is the most important aspect from an IT perspective is data security, cybersecurity. It's something we have to be focused on all the time. In fact, in my business, 20 years in the private sector, that was the #1 issue for most of my customers, and really got to the point when I ran for Congress. Of course, I couldn't continue that business. I sold it primarily because I knew that under the way things were, the question wasn't if someone was going to be hacked and lose data, it was when. And so one of the things that I learned when I was in the military is one principle is you don't have to secure what you don't have. So if you don't need data, don't keep it. But then you have the aspect of, yes, we have to secure the data that we do need to keep. Now, this is one thing that the federal government has yet to learn, is you don't need to acquire a whole lot of data and keep that data, especially if you're the federal government, which is the riskiest of anyone out there of letting data get out. And then you see more proposals like the one that we've heard recently. The craziest proposal is the banks have to report every transaction by Americans in their banks to the federal government. This is the type of thing that we don't need to be doing. However, there is data that is important that we do have, whether you're in the private sector, whether you're in the public sector. And that's where I see the value of the underlying technology of cryptocurrency, particularly blockchain, is a solution to our cybersecurity problems because of the distributed ledger aspect of it. Is the data is available but is not centrally located to where it could be taken. Mr. Brooks, can you discuss how blockchain and distributed ledger technology can enhance our cybersecurity posture?
Well, Mr. Loudermilk, it's good to see you, and I appreciate the question. The simplest answer, as I said earlier today, is that blockchains are as much about transparency as they are about security. So one of the biggest problems when you think about the biggest cyber hacks we've ever had in the United States is how long it took for us to figure out that they occurred. The case of Target, the case of Equifax, some of these things. We found out days and weeks later by accident that they occurred. And if you think about the Equifax hack in particular, initially we thought it was a small problem. Weeks later, we learned it was a medium-sized problem, and only months later did we learn it was a gigantic problem that involved all of our data because there was no transparency. The thing about blockchains is every single block as it is validated is publicly visible to the network. The other thing about blockchain is it's based on a consensus mechanism. So before you can have a change to the ledger, you have to have a significant majority of all of the validators agree that that's the correct change. And so unlike normal networks where one bad guy can defeat the entire system, here you have to have thousands of computers agreeing at the same time that the change can be made, and even then everyone sees it. that hiding in plain sight aspect is the safest thing about blockchain. It's why it's so critical to our security infrastructure.
And I think that's one of the most key values of this emerging technology is bringing us into a new era where we can do some of the things that we need to do without amassing this data. Another area I've been interested in is really with payments, and I've done some work on a related issue with the CFPB's regulation of remittance transfer. So, Ms. Dixon, understand that your organization is active in that space. Can you describe how blockchain and DLT are being used to facilitate payments?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is one of my favorite topics because it's something that actually is defining the use case that's happening today. I think that there are businesses that transact on the network. They can actually they can go from the interoperability with the traditional financial system is remarkable. You can actually take money from a bank account, put it into digital asset, transfer that value to the end wherever it's being sent, and then it can convert right back into a bank account. The fact that you have such complete interoperability with the existing financial infrastructure should give us all the ability to take excitement about elevating that technology to the right level so that we continue to innovate there. So payments are something that are constantly being leveraged on the Stellar network. They're done with business payments. They're also done with remittances from the personal standpoint. When you live in California, for example, and you want to send money to your family in another country, you can do so in 3 to 5 seconds and 100,000 transactions for less than a penny on the Stellar network. It's a remarkable use of this technology.
And this is what can happen if government doesn't get in the way of the development of technologies that benefit the individual. And so there are several other questions I have, but I see my time has expired, and I want to be respectful of everyone. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the
Thank you.
balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Acne, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development Insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here. Mr. Bankman-Fried, I'd like to start by asking you the first question. FTX US has a derivatives platform and recently bought Ledger X as part of that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And that platform is registered with the CFTC. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I just want to clarify something, and this isn't to say anybody's doing any wrong, it's just to get the lay of the land. You also have an exchange for Bitcoin and other tokens, but that is not registered with either the CFTC or the SEC. Is that correct?
That's correct. Currently, neither of them are primary markets regulators for spot Bitcoin to USD markets.
Okay, thank you. And I know you're registered as a money transmitter, but that's not the same kind of oversight that we'll see from a federal market regulator. I also sit on the Agriculture Committee, which oversees the CFTC, so a gap like this is especially concerning to me. And the big problem that I see here, from what I understand, is that the CFTC doesn't have regulatory authority for spot trading of commodities, just their derivatives. So that leaves consumers with inconsistent protections, which is a concern that I have. So Mr. Bankman-Fried, you and both Ms. Haas run exchanges, but the investor protections basically can be whatever the company separately come up with, and they won't necessarily be the same. Is that correct?
I completely agree with your worry. We do, in fact, have much the same investor protections on our spot markets as on our derivatives markets, but I would be very much supportive of a similar regime for spot commodities markets like Bitcoin USD markets as we see for the derivatives markets.
Oh, very good. I like to hear that. Thank you. Okay, so when it comes to oversight, a couple more questions here. Do you report your full order history publicly, either you, Mr. Bankman-Fried, or Ms. Haas, and are there public standards for that to make sure it's accurate?
We do report all of our public market data. It's available on our website. It's available via our API. We do not charge anyone anything for it and never intend to. I would be supportive of that becoming more than just a norm, but a regulatory standard as well.
We also
Okay,
make all
Ms.
of our
Haas?
data. We also make all of our data available, and we do not charge for our data. It's available to our customers.
Okay. And is that order history public as well?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. Bitcoin, which has almost $1 trillion invested in it, has CFTC oversight for people who are trading futures and options, but not for people who are trading the currency itself. Is that right?
That is essentially correct.
Okay, okay. So that kind of difference in protections is really what I want to focus on here. I'm not, here to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't buy, that they should have crypto or not have crypto. I think there's, pros and cons, and certainly I've had plenty of conversations with my own son who wants to get into crypto. But I'll tell you what I care about is that when folks do, I want to make sure that they're protected and they've got the same investor protections that they would for other forms of currency. So I'm asking, can you as an industry, and it seems like you can, benefit long-term from having more regulation that sets better standards to protect investors in this area?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And I think it's I'm not concerned about more regulation. I think getting consumer protection in areas where there is not currently enough can be extremely helpful for a robust ecosystem. I think it's just important to do so in a way that fits the product and in a way that fits the regulators as they are.
Okay, thank you for that. And listen, I agree. I think it's something that we absolutely need to look at. And I would certainly ask all of you to think about the steps that you can take within your own organizations to make crypto more safe and trustworthy for investors. But I completely agree with you that we've got to be doing something to make sure that we're protecting investors. There are things that you as exchanges have that you have to help the industry long term. You mentioned that you think we could do some of these regulations and they'd be good for the long-term growth. What do you think that could do to help you build trust and trust for folks in general for cryptocurrency?
I will say that, we've had conversations with a very large number of institutional players, everyone from banks, investment banks, pension funds. And this is the number one thing that comes up is what is the regulatory framework for the industry? How can we feel that we are protected both from a commercial standpoint, but also from a regulatory standpoint in pursuing these options for our investors? And I think it could be extremely helpful, to clarify the regulatory frameworks, to build them out where they are missing, and to make sure that we have streamlined and uniform standards that are clearly communicated.
Thank you so much for that. I'd love to make sure that crypto is safer and more trustworthy for investors. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly thankful to the witnesses for being here. Appreciate your expertise as we all learn more about the growing digital currency issue. Back in August of this year, the Cuban government announced their central bank would work on rules to officially recognize digital currencies. So I'm wondering whether the country's recent embrace of crypto could be a way for the communist regime to evade tough U.S. sanctions. So let's start with Mr. Bankman-Fried. What process does FTX use to ensure that rogue and frankly murderous autocratic regimes like Cuba cannot use an exchange to evade United States sanctions?
We run sanctions checks on all of our users. We conduct know your customer surveillance on them. In addition to that, we conduct surveillance on the blockchain and fiat assets that transfer into and out of our system.
Okay, thank you. Wanted to ask Ms. Haas the same question, propose the same question to you as it relates to Coinbase.
Largely the same answer. We similarly run OFAC tests on all of our customers, both on onboarding and then ongoing. We believe that sanctions are an effective tool of the U.S. government in combating illegal activity. In addition to our onboarding controls, we do transaction monitoring. We do surveillance on all of our transactions on our platform, but also have tools that are looking across the industry, and we partner with law enforcement on investigations.
Okay, so second question, let me set it up for you. One of the ways that bad actors or rogue states could try to fool exchanges is by using technology like VPN that spoof IP addresses, fooling others into thinking that they're in a different location. So let's go with Mr. Brooks on this one. Can you speak to the importance of moving away from IP addresses to verify location? And follow up to that, what is an alternative way of verifying location?
Well, a couple of quick answers. So on the compliance side, I think the use of VPNs to avoid geolocation and to avoid sort of geofencing is something that 3 years ago was effective and useful, and the industry has developed lots of technologies that make that much, much harder today. So, some of these decentralized tools, several of the companies have been mentioned already, Chainalysis, Elliptic, and some others, have an ability to actually trace IP addresses based on probabilistic sort of network information. So it's not just that that IP address might have been issued by an ISP in a given jurisdiction. It's also that that IP address is associated with lots of other transactions that could only be Cuba or could only be Libya or whatever. And the probability assessment is one of the things that makes this much easier. That's why the network is so important.
Okay, well, thank you. I referenced Cuba. The Cuban government's continued tyranny is personal for me and my family. My mother fled communist Cuba when she was 20 years old to come to the United States. She even recently wrote a book about the horrific experiences and the aftermath of the revolution there, including her time as a political prisoner in the Castro regime. And the Marxist Cuban government cannot be allowed to continue to oppress the Cuban people. Former President Trump's tough sanctions restrict access to resources for Cuba's rogue government. And I want to work with the members of this panel to ensure that the digital marketplace does not enable the communist Cuban regime or other bad countries around the world who hate us and kill their own people and are tyrannical. I'm sure we all share that goal. I know there are those who think that that's a role for the federal government to come in and issue a whole set of regulations because you can't do it yourselves. But I think it's better if we work with you, and if you can do it yourselves better than the federal government, that might be the answer. So thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Gottheimer, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for all our panelists for being here today. Very grateful. If I can start with Mr. Bankman-Fried first, please. From my role on the National Security Subcommittee on Financial Services, I'm committed to ensuring bad actors like terrorists and drug dealers cannot access the financial services sector for purposes contrary to U.S. interests. And while obviously I support cryptocurrency and its potential benefits in the digital payment space, one area remains particularly concerning for me: the theft of cryptocurrency and its potential use in illicit or terrorist financing. These issues are also related insofar as stolen funds may be used for nefarious purposes. I introduced my bill, H.R. 3685, the Hamas International Financing Prevention Act, in part because of the increased reporting around the use of cryptocurrency donations to support Hamas. 2 questions, if you don't mind. First, what are exchanges doing today to both ensure that consumers are protected from hacking and theft and to prevent bad actors such as Hamas and other terrorist organizations from accessing cryptocurrency markets? And in what context, too, well, in what context would you flag a transaction to law enforcement, and have you ever flagged transactions for law enforcement agencies?
Yeah, so I guess I'll first briefly talk about the security aspect of this, about stopping breaches to accounts, where we mandate that all users have 2-factor authentication for all of their accounts. We have a very broad suite of security practices that all users can access on the site, in addition to all of the Know Your Customer policies. On the bad actor side, we conduct KYC surveillance on all users of the exchange. We do that on all deposits and withdrawals using multiple tools on the blockchain and for fiat currencies. And to address, I think, your question about law enforcement, we work cooperatively with law enforcement here in the United States and globally on tracking down any bad actors. We are in constant communication. We strive to be as helpful as we can be. The combination of the Know Your Customer surveillance that we do, plus the transparency of the public ledgers of blockchains, actually can make it a really powerful tool for tracking down any funds from illicit activity. We've used that. We have been participating in freezing a substantial amount of assets on our platform in cooperation with law enforcement, and look forward to continuing to work with them globally.
Thank you so much. Mr. Allaire, the President's Working Group's recent paper on stablecoins included a recommendation that all stablecoin issuers be required to become insured depository institutions such as banks. I understand that Circle has stated that it intends to become a bank, but currently backs the USDC in circulation 1-to-1 with reserves held at partner banks. I'm working on a bill that could potentially implement a number of these recommendations. If I can ask, do you think it is necessary for safety and soundness for stablecoin issuers to themselves be insured depository institutions, or is partnering with insured depository institutions sufficient? And what are the pros and cons of each model, please?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think it's a very important issue. As noted, we have decided to pursue a national bank charter, and are open to being an FDIC insured bank as well. I think however, there's some subtlety in this topic, and I think it's important for the committee to consider it. A full reserve digital currency model, such as USDC, where 100% of the assets are fully reserved in high-quality liquid assets such as cash and short duration U.S. Treasuries, is not the same as a bank deposit, where the bank is in turn taking the deposit and rehypothecating it and lending it. And really the purpose of FDIC insurance is for that fractional reserve lending that takes place. And so I think the real question in our minds is, I think it can be really powerful for a stablecoin issuer to have a federal bank charter, to be able to access the Fed and hold cash at the Fed in terms of the ultimate form of safety and soundness for those cash assets, but not necessarily being lending banks that are rehypothecating capital. The form of insurance perhaps could be investigated. I know that the FDIC itself has been thinking about what are potential appropriate forms of insurance on stablecoin issuers, and so I think it's a live issue. But just applying the kind of apples-to-apples model on a full reserve banking model, I think does raise some questions. So I think ultimately, coming back to your question, I think that statutes in the United States should support stablecoin issuers that are operating at a state level, at a federal level, and support money services businesses as well as banks being active participants in the stablecoin ecosystem. And I think it's important that the barrier to entry in the stablecoin space not be so high that startups that are innovating as money services businesses can't participate in this innovation.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. The United States has a huge opportunity with crypto, but my fear is that this regulatory state, it's going to crack down on an industry that the regulators, they really don't understand yet, and it's going to force the next generation of financial tech to be created outside of our country. Well, we can't let that happen. So, Mr. Brooks, it's good to see you again. Where do companies draw the line and say that enough is enough with this anti-innovation, quote, regulation by enforcement, and then just decide to take their industry elsewhere to another country? Where's the line?
Well, Mr. Budd, it's good to see you, and thank you for that question. What I would say is, in some aspects of the industry, the line is super clear. There are some products that are legal in other countries and are just not legal here. So I take some of the investment products we've talked about earlier today, for example, exchange-traded funds. One of the things that makes crypto risky is that consumers may not understand the difference between one token and another token, and so they may want to diversify, much as I own an S&P 500 mutual fund. We don't allow that in the United States. We do allow it in Canada. We allow it in Germany, Singapore, Portugal, and a number of other places. So if you're a developer of those products, there's no fuzzy line. It's super clear. You can't do that here, so you have to go abroad, okay? There are some other places.
Can you say why we can't do that here?
Sure. It's because the Securities and Exchange Commission has consistently refused to approve products that other G20 nations have approved.
So we're behind the curve?
Unquestionably.
So given your previous experience running the OCC, I'd love to hear your perspective on where a regulator's authority begins and ends. Remember the joke earlier this year that everything's infrastructure? Well, it seems like Chairman Gensler thinks that everything is a digital asset that he can regulate. He cites the Howey and the Reeves test without providing any other explanations. So, Mr. Brooks, what are we missing? Because Chairman Gensler clearly doesn't see a limit to his regulatory authority in this area.
Well, Congressman, one thing I learned running my little agency is that the U.S., and this is not specific to crypto, the U.S. is sort of unique among the developed countries in our fragmented approach to regulation. So when I hear people talk about the idea that we need one regulator for crypto, I would say we should first have one regulator for banks, but we have 3 of them, or if you're an investment bank, 5 of them. So that's inherent in the system that we've got. What I say to that is the last thing we need to do is add another regulator to a system that's already got dozens of regulators. What we need to do instead is have parity for crypto activity along with traditional finance. If I'm a crypto lending platform, I should probably be regulated by the FDIC. If I'm a crypto trading platform, I should probably be regulated by the CFTC and SEC. But somehow we treat crypto, because it's new, as different from everything else. And I'm going to argue that crypto is just a step function improvement in the system. We already have a regulatory system. The laws are super clear how it works, but there's something about crypto that scares people. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just because it's new. But I remember in my banking law class, when banks were first allowed to use computers to keep ledgers, people sued over that at the time. I remember when I was a second-year lawyer and we got email, and the ABA said lawyers couldn't use email because it would travel over this mysterious network of computers. These all seem ridiculous today, but it seems like we haven't really learned the underlying lesson, which is technology usually advances human flourishing. We have a regulatory system. Let's use it.
Thank you for that. Ms. Haas, as you're aware, the infrastructure bill was signed into law last month and had lots of problems for digital assets. So I was very vocal about a need for a fix for this, and I was proudly supporting Ranking Member McHenry's bill to make those fixes. So would you please address some of your concerns and why those flaws would be so bad for the crypto community?
Thank you, and thank you for your support on this important bill. So first of all, I want to make it clear that Coinbase supports tax payments in crypto. We think that everybody should be paying their taxes, and we think that centralized entities like Coinbase should be reporting, no different than a Schwab, no different than a Fidelity. It's important value-added service for our customers. But what concerned us about the drafting of the infrastructure bill, specifically to the tax provisions, was that these are complex issues. Crypto taxation is complex, the technology has new players in the space, and that we didn't have the public comment period that we would typically have for something so complex. And so what happened was the risk of an unintended consequence, and I think that we can still solve this. I think that we are not to the place that it could be scary, but the definition of a broker was potentially overly wide and could be interpreted to include players such as miners, such as the hardware wallets that do not have access to this information, that have no ability to comply with reporting regimes, and then could be consequence. There could be penalties, there could be federal risk to them. So we thought it was overly broad. And then separately in 6050I, we thought that there was additional reporting risk that was privacy and also could be deemed overly broad and pull in parties that were not necessarily deemed to be covered by this rule.
Thank you very much. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I think you need to make a correction. You referred to Mr. Brooks as having been at SEC, and he has been saying all along he was at OCC.
I never made that reference, but thank you.
Well, all right. Thank you very much. We appreciate your presence here today and your expertise in banking law. Thank you. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, who is also the chair of the Task Force on Financial Technology, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great hearing. I want to thank all of our witnesses as well. Prior to the creation of the subcommittee on financial services, we had a terrorist financing task force that I chaired for about 8 years. So I'm keenly sensitive to the issues around Know Your Customer and AML. And I worked a lot with FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, on traditional banking protections with regard to terrorist financing and money laundering. And I know that at the end of last year, FinCEN actually issued a rulemaking proposal to require banks and money service businesses to submit reports and verify the identity of customers involved with wallets for virtual currency. And so this particular rulemaking focused on those wallets that were hosted in low compliance jurisdictions and were identified by FinCEN as wallets which were not hosted by a financial institution called unhosted wallets. And the requirements that FinCEN came up with are sort of similar to what we use now for money transmitters. So, Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Allaire, your firms in particular were vocally opposed to that rulemaking. And I heard your responses to Mr. Foster and to others regarding identity. And I want to try to understand Can you share why the transactions involving virtual assets and payments involving those wallets that are quite similar to Western Union transmissions or MoneyGrams, why you objected to what looks like a fairly similar regulatory approach? Mr. Allaire, if you might take a crack at it.
Thank you, Congressman Lynch, for the question. It's a very important question. First, I would simply start by saying I think FinCEN has done an excellent job at looking at the issues of money laundering, terrorist financing in the context of virtual assets, virtual currencies. They led the way as the first federal regulator to, in fact, put in place rules around that back in 2013 that led firms like Circle, Coinbase, and many others here to put in place licensing, supervision around Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering provisions, and the like. I think the specific issue at hand, which you are correct, we had some significant objections to, was really twofold. One was there was an introduction of a 11th hour rulemaking that did not have significant public comment. And I think at the bottom of that issue is there are some really significant things about the way digital assets and blockchains work that we want to make sure, if we're going to be introducing rules around reporting, that they take account of the unique things with public blockchain infrastructures in particular. Notably, public blockchain infrastructures are in some ways like the public internet or the World Wide Web or email. They're open networks that anyone can connect to, join, and use. And it's one of the really powerful things that has made information exchange free. And I think it's one of the things that we believe with digital assets on blockchains can make value exchange much more frictionless for people around the world. And a part of that is that there are, the ability for an individual to self-custody assets with a piece of hardware or a piece of software. That piece of software could be downloaded from an app store, and they're self-custodying a stablecoin like USDC or a Bitcoin. And that's the software maker itself is not involved in facilitating a customer transaction. They're really just a software developer providing technology that end users can use. And I think the rule as it was outlined would kind of be a square peg, round hole, or a bit of a blunt force instrument. And what we argued, and I think is hopefully going to bear fruit significantly over the next year, is that what we really need are ways to provide proof of digital identities. A firm like Circle or a firm like FTX or Coinbase or Paxos or other members, other folks testifying here, could provide a cryptographic proof that someone has been KYC'd. And that proof could actually be carried around with them in a hardware wallet or a software wallet. And then you'd have the ability to know that you've got legitimate actors, to be able to have the right information about users without having essentially more PII or personal identifiable information being broadcasted really broadly. And so I think our view was give the industry more time to develop technology that can allow these forms of transactions to happen, but still preserve privacy and take advantage of the really significant security benefits that come from cryptography.
Okay, that's fair. I know my time has expired, so thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you also for convening today's hearing. Thank you to the witnesses. I know we've been here for some time, but it's been very informative, and I appreciate it, and I know we all do. Ms. Haas, if I could with you, could we talk about the Crypto Rating Council that I believe Coinbase and other industry players created to determine what digital assets look more like securities and which ones don't? If you could you talk to me about how the council makes its determination and who's involved in the process?
Thank you for the question. So the Crypto Rating Council is an independent entity that works to serve industry participants such as Coinbase with an assessment of digital assets underneath the Howey test. So it's looking at the white papers that new asset projects put forth and making a determination under the Howey test whether or not that new project is more likely than not to meet the definition of a security under U.S. federal securities laws. Independent law firms are the ones who are doing this assessment, who are U.S. securities laws experts, and looking at facts and circumstances to make an assessment.
Thank you. If I could ask you, could you talked about securities, can you talk about what degree, if any, the SEC and other stakeholders have been involved in, what the discussions have been with in terms of the framework?
Thank you for the opportunity to address this. So at this point in time, the SEC has not provided a clear definition about what is or is not a security. They've asked us to rely on the Howey and Reeves test, and we, companies like Coinbase, companies like FTX and others, pay careful attention to ongoing litigation that is existing in the space, news that we see, but we are left to interpret based on our interpretation of law for what is and is not a security at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Haas. Mr. Brooks, if I could to you, thank you also for being here. If I could, I think there are, obviously there are people who believe that cryptocurrency is difficult, maybe even impossible to track. Can you talk about that as it relates to the blockchain? And while we talk about illicit activities, alleged illicit activities, oftentimes would be investigated by federal authorities, could you explain maybe the fallacy in that as if you were talking to our local police chiefs or local sheriffs?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Kussoff. I actually do this talk at local Rotary clubs and things around the country all the time, so I think I can do that pretty well. I think the easiest way to understand it is let's contrast blockchain transactions with normal banking transactions to see how much easier it is to trace them on a blockchain than it is in a banking transaction. So let's imagine for a moment that I would never do this because this would be flagrantly illegal, but let's say I bought you lunch, okay? And let's say that afterwards you wanted to Venmo me your payment back, right? So you hit your Venmo button on your iPhone and you sent me money. What many people don't understand is that there are 7 or 8 different steps in the Venmo transaction. So all Venmo does is send an instruction to your bank. Your bank then receives that instruction, they write it down in their books and records, and then they then send an instruction to an underlying transfer network. It could be the automated clearinghouse, could be the FedWire system or something else. That system then contacts my bank. It inquires whether my bank has enough money to pay you. Once that's been done, then there's a debit from my account. It's very complicated. And in any one of those steps, information could be lost, there could be a breach, something bad could happen. Versus in a blockchain, there are no intermediaries. I'm not sending instructions to a third party to send instructions to another third party to eventually send you money. I've sent you money. And when the block is validated, I can see that my wallet address transferred that value to your wallet address. Simple as that. The easiest way for people to understand how easy this is, because we've had a lot of talk of hacking and cyber security issues, the reason that we found the bad guys in the Colonial Pipeline hack was because they asked for Bitcoin. If they had asked for diamonds, if they had asked for cash, if they'd asked for almost any other thing, we'd never have caught the bad guys. We caught the bad guys because, not in spite of, because they used Bitcoin and we could tell exactly where the money went.
So the blockchain, because the blockchain was used, it was traceable.
Correct.
And just briefly, because my time is expiring, again, as you're talking to Rotary clubs, you could give specific examples where the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies use the blockchain, in fact, to help trace and help determine?
When I used to work at Coinbase, I ran a group that facilitated those customers. They were our clients. We did work for them.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, to Ranking Member Henry, both of you for hosting the hearing. Mr. Cascarilla, I want to touch briefly on the risk that stablecoins might pose to our broader financial system. The President's Working Group report, which we spent plenty of time talking about today, expressed concern that any perceived instability could trigger a run-on on that stablecoin. In 2008, we saw the dangers of instability in prime money market funds, and now rating agencies are saying that. So how do you respond to the assertion by the president's working group that a run on stablecoins could cause systemic instability?
Thank you for the question. I think this is a crucial topic when it comes to stablecoins. I think the key point here is to define stablecoin. And depending on how you define it, it creates different risks. If a stablecoin is backed by only cash and cash equivalents, essentially money that's sitting in an FDIC-insured bank account or sitting in T-bills that mature in 3 months, there is no risk of a run. It's liquid cash. You've taken simply $1 and you've tokenized it. And there's very good uses for that, and there's really good reasons to set it up that way. Of course, you could decide to back your stablecoin with other assets, and certain issuers do. It could be loans, it could be CDs, it also could be other types of securities. And in that case, you start to have not really a stable coin, but you have something that looks more like maybe a bank deposit. And in that case, it would make a lot of sense, I think, for a banking regulatory regime to oversee it. And also, it could be that it looks more like a money market fund because it's backed by certain types of securities, and it would make sense for the SEC to oversee it. So we are a trust company.
Okay, I was going to ask how stable coins are not similar to money market funds, but I think you've made some clarification there. So, Mr. Haas, in October of this year, Coinbase released an operational framework of the digital asset policy proposal in which you advocate for the creation of a new self-regulatory organization. You indicate that incorporating an SRO into the regulatory supervision of marketplaces will speed the development and enforcement of an appropriately tailored digital asset industry rule. So in your view, how can Congress and industry best come together to begin laying the foundation for a successful regulatory framework for digital asset trading platforms such as yours?
Thank you so much for this question. So I want to clarify that first in our proposal, we are seeking one single federal regulator. It could be an existing federal regulator. We're not asking for the creation of a new federal regulator. And the value that we think of having an SRO would be, this is complex. There is new innovation happening in crypto every single day. We haven't even touched on NFTs or DAOs in this committee hearing today. And we think it's important that there's a nimble group that is constantly looking at the changes in crypto. And so that's why we recommended having an SRO in addition to a single federal regulator. The way that we would love to work with you all is we think this is an important step in the process. We think that this hearing is important, but we really believe that having policymakers deeply understand the technology, getting input from the industry, understanding the use cases will help craft prudent regulation here. We believe that we agree with you all on first principles of regulation, but the how we get there is going to look very different in crypto than it has in our traditional financial markets that relied on intermediaries. I think many of the testimonies on this panel have spoken very similarly about the challenges we see, and we'd love to work with you in partnership.
Thank you, ma'am. This is to all the witnesses, and it can be a yes or no. Would you commit to, as a two-time HBCU graduate, I care deeply about making sure that your companies reflect the diversity of our country. So yes or no, would you commit to sharing data about the racial and gender makeup of your companies? I want everyone, if you can, to answer it quickly, yes or no. Yes. Are you committed to doing that? All right.
Yes.
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 We'd be happy to follow up with your office.
Well, great. We would appreciate that very much. It is a concern of not only this committee, but certainly of one of our co-chairs, Joyce Beatty, and myself, and some others. So thank you very much, and thank you for your responses. And Madam Chair, I'm going to yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, good afternoon. I appreciate everyone being here and certainly appreciate the dialogue that has been engendered thus far. I will admit to you my erudition on such matters is very, very low, and so I'm on a genuine fact-finding mission, not on a confirmation of my preconceived notions about how this could be used or alternatively how it should be treated by regulators. I think specifically to Mr. Allaire to start with, would you define stablecoin for me?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Congressman. There are many types of stablecoins.
Right.
There are stablecoins are called stablecoins because they are intended to hold a stable value. I think the name.
Can you clarify and be more specific? A stable value relative to what?
Well, relative to some underlying reference asset.
Right,
So
but that reference asset in and of itself may, in fact, be volatile, right? If I said this had 100% correlation with 1 ounce of gold,
Sure.
right, that would be stable relative to gold,
right.
but not stable relative in an absolute sense, I should say.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So say the purchasing power of a dollar is changing rapidly with inflation, and so, or in other countries, hyperinflation, or there's deflationary assets and so on.
Right.
So the reference asset obviously has a huge
So
impact.
you brought this up, and I wanted to delve further into that, and I appreciate that. So not a lot, maybe not even the majority, some non-trivial portion of stable coins are backed by US dollars and are transferable to and from dollars, right? So in essence, explain to me the value proposition to me owning a stable coin that I can convert into dollars as opposed to owning the dollars themselves. What's the value proposition to a consumer?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think it's good to use analogies sometimes on this.
Right.
It's sort of like the difference between having a postal letter versus an email. A digital version of a letter can move at the speed of the internet to anyone for free.
Right.
That's really an upgrade to the functionality of a letter, for example.
So-
Or digital music, the same kind of attribute. So digital currency dollars inherit the kind of superpowers of the internet, the speed, the reach, the interoperability,
So I
and
think,
so forth.
yeah, net summary of that, right, is it is no different as a store of value than owning dollars, right, because it is convertible to and from dollars, but is different in its transaction characteristics, right? It can move faster and presumably at a cheaper cost of transaction than perhaps transacting in dollars. Is that a fair way to say that?
I think that's basically correct, although I'd say well-designed stablecoins are safer than bank deposits because bank deposits, you're taking a risk on the lending book of the underlying bank. And so you have run risk, you have default risk of all of the deposits and loans that might sit in a bank. A full reserve form of money, which is what a dollar digital currency such as USDC represents, is actually a safer form to hold, not just store value, but as a transactional medium as well.
Right, assuming that you hold your dollars in a bank account.
That's right.
Yeah, there is some level of counterparty risk. We have worked hard, frankly, in this country and through a regulatory environment of minimizing that and through federal government guarantees, but that remains non-zero if trivial, right? So walk me through the transaction value of owning a stablecoin, right? And here's my view just outside of this, right? I understand the notion that if I go to a retailer that accepts that stablecoin, right, then I can transact with them, presumably at a lower cost to that retailer. Hopefully my prices are lower on account of that, and I can transact faster with them. But there is a non-zero transaction cost associated with getting into that stablecoin, right? So I've kind of traded this notion of accelerating my pace of transaction and lowering the cost once I get into the system, but there are costs to get into the system, right? I have to buy whatever that stablecoin is from dollars, right?
Yeah, so I can speak in the case of USDC.
Please.
So if an institution wants to transfer dollars into USDC, we don't charge a fee for that. And
But I have to get set up to do so, right?
You need an
It's not
account.
I can't just go and get a debit card, use my debit card out of my bank account. I have to set up an account, right? Presumably you have some process by which I do that. Once I get over that hurdle, then I can transact inside that.
That's correct. And I think many users of stablecoins keep their value in stablecoins because they are now able to use a very, very efficient payment and settlement medium.
Yeah.
So that's attributed to the high growth that you've seen is partially attributed to that.
So is the value proposition that this network of those that accept this is going to expand, so more people are going to keep that in stablecoins? And then my second question is going to be, why can't the same technology that runs stablecoins eventually run the payment system in dollars? Right? Won't we eventually cut out the middle step of having to convert to a stablecoin and then transact in this frictionless and speedier environment? Won't we eventually have to figure out, run that through the existing payment system?
Well, I think there's two points here. So one is, dollar digital currencies like USDC are both kind of protocols and are a representation, a form factor for a dollar. And there are network effects there, just like there are network effects in other internet protocols that we use for things. And I think that's significant. To the second question, I think in some ways it's a question of semantics. when I use the IOU settlement system of a Visa card, I'm not actually like spending dollars per se. There's a bunch of IOUs that are on a centralized ledger that are keeping track of things. And then ultimately underneath, there's a Fed wire that goes from one bank to another. We experience it as, well, this is this card, and there's a whole elaborate kind of system underneath that charges fees. I think what we see, well-regulated stablecoins are an upgrade to those kinds of payment systems to be ready for the internet era.
I appreciate the chair's indulgence.
Thank you.
Sorry.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses who are here today at this hearing. Before I get into the heart of my questions today, there was a slight discrepancy in some of the testimony and questioning from earlier today. I just wanted Ms. Haas to clarify very quickly. Earlier today in the hearing, Representative Velasquez asked about proprietary trading on the Coinbase platform. And in that moment, I believe you had told her, quote, that Coinbase does not engage in proprietary trading on our platform. All prices are established, etc. However, in looking at the Coinbase rules under Section 3.21 under Coinbase Corporate Ops, it says, Coinbase Inc., which owns and operates Coinbase Pro and Exchange, also trades its own corporate funds on Coinbase Pro and Exchange. And I just wanted to give you briefly the opportunity to clarify.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to clarify. There's a few things that we do in our business. So one is we do have a corporate investment portfolio that every month we make an investment of crypto and add to our balance sheet. We've not sold that. We don't trade it actively, but we do increase the investment on a monthly basis on pre-established investment protocols. We do buy those on our exchange.
Got it. Understood. Thank you very much. So to the heart of the matter. Crypto, as we know, is a growing industry. It's rising in market value from $500 billion last year to more than $3 trillion as of November of this year, 2021. There are a lot of advocates, proponents of the cryptocurrency industry that discuss the creation of new digital currencies, I should say, and building safer, more inclusive system outside of the traditional financial sector. But I kind of want to explore this assertion a little bit more. Mr. Allaire, a substantial portion of the buying and selling of cryptocurrencies is done with stable coins, correct?
A significant amount is traded with stablecoins, yes.
It's about 75%. Does that sound about right to you?
I don't have the data in front of me, but it does sound roughly correct.
And these stable coins are designed to be backed by certain reserve assets, whether they are primarily USD or safe, highly liquid cash substitutes. Essentially, a coin to be stable in value so that people can kind of use it in a larger world of crypto where other coins could perhaps be a little bit more volatile in their value.
I can certainly speak to the design of USDC. I can't really speak to others. So yes, USDC is designed as a payment instrument under electronic money law in the United States. And so it's cash and short duration US government treasuries, which is the underlying instruments for the stored value.
In fact, your firm recently announced a transition to one-to-one backing in dollars of USD coin after it was found that only 60% of the coin was backed by cash or cash substitutes. So if the cryptocurrency industry, hypothetically, lost its ability to use stable coins as a bridge to trade in and out of dollars tomorrow, would that cause a significant shift? It seems as though it would not be able to work the way that it does currently, correct?
Well, I think a primary reason why stablecoins are so powerful is that they're a superior form of settlement. And so the existing banking system moves slowly. Funds take several days for them to move, and there are significant fees, and the access to that can be limited. Whereas blockchains operate continuously, and settlement happens at the speed of the internet. And so I think it is important that payments and settlement in these new forms of internet financial products and services can operate at the speed of the internet. So I think it's essential, in fact.
I see. Thank you. And so lastly, what would you say to some of the folks who are listening to what some folks are saying, not just here on this panel, but in the larger world? So the folks that say, what do you say to the folks that say, basically, this doesn't seem like a new financial system per se, but really an extension or perhaps expansion of our present one?
Well, I would disagree with that. I think what I believe we're seeing is a new open infrastructure layer on the internet, a missing infrastructure layer of the internet that is designed around value exchange and economic coordination, that is rooted in immutable data, the ability to interact with counterparties in a very, very safe way that hasn't existed before on the internet. And really, many of the efficiencies that the internet brings in terms of moving information brought into moving value, but also with greater degrees of security than are often offered through the existing financial system. So I really do believe we're building a new global economic infrastructure layer, and we're certainly—
And you would say that that's not distinct. You would argue that that is distinct, not an expansion or an increase in the sophistication of our current financial system.
I believe, for this to take hold, it needs to be well integrated with our existing financial system, and we've long believed in a kind of hybrid model that does that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I truly appreciate this hearing. This is a great hearing. I want to start with Mr. Brooks, and I'm going to attempt to respond to some of the objections, which I believe demonstrate a complete and utter misunderstanding of what we're even doing here today. One contention is that the vibe of crypto is a stick-it-to-the-man vibe, but in actuality, it's dominated and controlled by big tech and Wall Street. While the culture may be somewhat accurately described, the notion that a handful of big tech leaders and Wall Street banks somehow created and now control crypto is absurd on its face. And frankly, anyone who would make such a claim, I believe, should be ignored on this topic. My contention is that Web3, crypto, blockchain, et cetera, by its very structure, has the ability to solve some of the most difficult and frustrating problems that the current version of the internet and the financial system have, where a narrow set of platforms control what we see, how we interact, and what we buy, while millions of Americans remain completely disconnected from the financial system. Web3 can turn this entire thing on its head in a very empowering way. So my question's simple. How specifically could you see Web3 solving some of these bigger challenges associated with the current version of the internet and the financial system?
Look, Congressman Gonzalez, thanks for the question. When I go back to the criticisms that you were just recounting, the only part of that I heard was hip. I'm going with hip. The rest of it, we can come to. But in terms of the problems being solved, I think the first issue is the biggest critics of cryptocurrency have been the biggest banks. Those are the people who are the most concerned about the entry of stablecoins into the payment system, about the ability of crypto assets to build networks that are away from the clearinghouse. Those are the biggest critics, and so I think that tells you a lot of what you need to know. And the reason is because the way that Web3 solves a lot of problems, it's really twofold. First of all, it eliminates the toll collector role of traditional banks and traditional broker-dealers. The main thing that they do is they employ large numbers of human beings maintaining ledgers of account and allocating credit for a fee. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies do that without human beings and with no fee. And the elimination of minimum account balance fees, the $25 wire transfer fee that your bank charges to give you 3 days to send money abroad, those are gone.
Thank you.
That's what's so important. But the last part is it unlocks value that traditional economic structures don't unlock. The creator economy, play to earn in the gaming system, those don't exist.
So I want to go to Ms. Haas on that. Building off this, in your testimony, you mentioned use cases for Web3 in the creator and gaming economies. Could you please outline a specific use case and discuss how Web3 can empower creators and artists over mega tech platforms, which was implied earlier? And quickly, please, if you could.
All right, let's talk really quickly. I'll cite the one that we just talked about earlier, which is in the month of November, play to earn. So these are where video games, one can play a video game and earn NFTs. Those NFTs are in-game experiences. So if anyone here has young kids who are playing with Roblox, playing with Minecraft, playing with these, there's in-game experiences where you can buy avatars, you can buy various things. These can become NFTs. These NFTs then can be sold for value. And so what we're having here is these kind of the concept of a play to earn. You can play the video game, you can earn money, you can then monetize that back into fiat, and you can create these new economies and these new communities that have increasing value.
Thank you. Mr. Bankman-Fried, I believe you live in Hong Kong, is that correct?
Sorry, repeat that?
Do you live in Hong Kong, is that correct?
I do not anymore.
Oh, okay. Well, let me ask the question
I
differently.
did at one point.
So 10 years ago, certainly 20, 30 years ago, if you wanted to start a major internet company, you probably wanted to do it in the United States. You probably wanted to do it where you grew up, in Stanford on the coast in Silicon Valley, for a whole host of reasons, one of which being a very, very conducive, innovative environment. When I look at Web3, I see a lot of projects moving overseas. To what degree is the current regulatory environment in the United States contributing to this change where projects are now being built and domiciled in nations not the United States, whereas in the previous versions of the internet they were?
I do think it has contributed to that. I'm optimistic that we're going to see changes to the framework over the next few years that will bring us into a world that can make the United States the source of the deepest and most liquid markets in the cryptocurrency ecosystem. I don't think we've seen that historically. And if you look at the difference between the volume distribution of crypto and digital assets versus most other industries, you can see that.
Mr. Brooks, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, Congressman, as I said earlier, there are certain activities that our G20 partners seem to think are perfectly appropriate, legitimate, and subject to regulation, and we keep resisting. Those have moved abroad.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for everyone that have been coming forward in regards to this important issue. Cryptocurrency like Bitcoin currently consumes enough energy to power a small nation, and that's something that continues to be missed in this debate around this issue. And, the University of Cambridge analysis estimated that Bitcoin mining consumes 121 terawatts hours a year. To put that in perspective for everyone, that's more electricity than the entire country Argentina consumes. That's more than the consumption of Google, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft combined. One Bitcoin transaction, a single purchase, sale, or transfer uses the same amount of electricity as the typical US household uses in more than a month. And so this is really outstanding to me, and many folks do not know this, many Americans and folks that are talking about this issue. And so, Ms. Dixon, can you explain why for a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin that rely on proof of work model mining is such an energy intensive process?
Thank you for the question. This is a really important area, obviously, in terms of sustainability and the focus on what we do in this space. We should always be trying to do it better and much more efficiently. In Bitcoin is the proof of the way that Bitcoin consensus is achieved is through really complicated math equations. And so there's a lot of energy that's needed to be used to be able to make that happen. I know best about the consensus mechanism on Stellar, which is the Stellar Consensus Protocol, which can be done on a very small computer, any of the ones that you have in front of you. And we had a University of London did a study on the Stellar network itself, and the network is low in terms of energy consumption. It's around 0.00022 kilowatts per hour for each transaction. That's less than a transaction for Visa. So that's a really important comparison for us all to think about. So not every consensus mechanism is proof of work or proof of stake. Again, there are many, many different ones out there, and depending on the mechanism, it depends on the energy consumption. But it's definitely important for us to be able to try to do this better, more efficiently, and to consider the sustainability concerns around it.
No, I'm so glad you talked about a model that potentially, to shrink cryptocurrency's enormous carbon footprint. I'm particularly alarmed that previously, idled, shut down coal plants like the one operated by Greenwich Generation in Seneca Falls, New York, are now being brought back online to aid in cryptocurrency mining. And I don't know if the chairwoman knows this, but like in Montana, a coal-fired generating station is now providing 100% of its energy to Marathon Digital Holdings for Bitcoin mining under the power purchase agreement. Prior to the crackdown in China, it was estimated that nearly 2/3 of all Bitcoin mining took place in China, included in regions with very heavy power generation, such as Mongolia and other areas. But Ms. Dixon, should the world's central banks and governments be taking a more active role in monitoring and regulating cryptocurrency in order to bring energy consumption and carbon emissions in line with our own targets here in our country at the Paris Agreement? What would that look like?
I think it's really important for us as an industry to really focus on this issue, even without regulation. I think it's something that you need to always balance the value of what you receive in terms of the harm that's actually created to the environment. So we constantly have to be doing that kind of analysis. I think that we all need to focus on minimizing the energy consumption as much as possible, and then think about how we can work with governments to be able to consider the best way to achieve that kind of the carbon neutral status that I think a lot of folks want us to get to. So I encourage constant discussion. I encourage us to be innovative. This is one of the wonderful things about blockchain and just innovation generally. You look and you use technology to help to solve problems just like this.
Yeah, and the proof of work model fundamentally is incompatible with the environmental neutral future. And so, what tools, you're saying we got to move in this direction, Ms. Dixon. What tools can policymakers like ourselves look at to incentivize, to move us towards away from that model? How can policymakers accelerate that transition away from carbon intensive mining? We know our planet is burning. The climate crisis is here. And I just want to get the cryptocurrency community to become part of the solution and not make this crisis even worse. So can you talk about things that you would suggest for us to be working on in regards to this issue?
I think it's really important. We've actually engaged a third party to be able to look at the additional energy consumption, not just for what as I mentioned, the University of London did with respect to the work that they did. But I do think it's important to be able, and we're engaging a third party to look at all of the different transactions and how the network actually can even be better and better with this with respect to Stellar. I think that same kind of work can be done with all of the different types of consensus mechanisms out there. So I think research and more focus on what we can do to achieve sustainability and our sustainability goals is an important mechanism, and I think it would be really good to continue that conversation with you.
Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, and thanks to Ranking Member McHenry for holding this hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for hanging in with us for such a long period of time. Your testimony and participation today is very important to helping us understand this area and craft the appropriate policies going forward. Mr. Bankman-Fried, FTX and FTX US have grown substantially over the past several years. Could you tell us about the economic impact from your perspective that FTX US has in this country?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. In addition to obviously the impact in terms of the hiring that we're doing and the support of a number of initiatives in the country related to job training and education, we're also hoping that we can help provide financial services to people who have not had easy access to those before. If you think about the number of intermediaries that are involved in a traditional financial transaction, whether it's using a bank or whether it's investing your assets, that's a lot of points that can be very difficult to navigate for a number of people, both in this country and in the world. We aim to be able to provide services to everyone here, all easy to access on a mobile phone, giving inclusive and equitable access to financial markets that have been missing to a number of people.
So obviously, you describe a great many benefits to the U.S. economy. So in your view, how do we keep this innovation happening in the United States?
So I think I'm optimistic that, on the regulatory side, we're not that far from that point. And I think that there are a few clarifications that could go a very long way here. I think that on the market side, having a framework with a single regulatory structure, and it might have multiple regulators involved in it. The CFTC and SEC are both likely to be involved to some extent, but having a single unified framework for futures and spot digital assets could go a long way towards providing the sort of experience that you can offer in a lot of jurisdictions today. I think that giving clarity on the stablecoin side of audit requirements for the reserves but without sort of squashing innovation by requiring only a very limited number of institutions